Orson Welles arrived in Hollywood in 1940 at the age of 25 and on his own terms, a carte blanche contract with RKO. But as the gossip columns began to point out, months were slipping by and Welles still hadn't got a project off the ground. There was a year before you made Kane, is that?
Yes, and that year I was busy preparing to make the Heart of Darkness. I wrote the script and we designed the sets and we were all ready to go, and we couldn't get $50,000 off the budget, so they wouldn't let me do it. So that was the first film I was going to make. The contract was negotiated in New York, and this superb contract only happened because I didn't much want to make a movie. And I thought the only way I'd possibly make it would be without anybody interfering. So I asked for things nobody'd ever had, and nobody ever has had since, written out. They have that kind of power now because once you let a director loose with $40 million, there's nothing you can do about it. But in my case, I was given a limited budget but unlimited control, and the studio wasn't even allowed to see the rushes, if you can believe such a thing.
Because you were 25 and you had this amazing contract, did you sense an enormous amount of resentment around Hollywood?
Oh, yes, of course. Of course, a big resentment. Ward Bond cut my tie off in the middle of Chasen's restaurant. We went out in the parking lot and had it out, and there was a tremendous resentment from, of course, because nowadays every star has directed a movie. Even the TV stars direct some of their segments. It's perfectly normal for actors to direct themselves, but nobody had done that since von Stroheim, and it was unheard of. And then that I should be the author and absolute producer. Now, of course, the producers hated me most, because if I could do all those things, then what is the need for a producer?
Were you able just to barge through it? Did it affect you personally?
No, because I was very lucky, you see. I brought all my Mercury actors with me, so I had a little world of my own. And I thought that'd be a great thing in a movie, to have nobody in the film you'd ever seen before. Because those were in the days when every studio made 120 pictures a year. And those faces were all so well known, and I thought to see a movie in which everybody is new. And I liked my people, and we got along well together, and we'd been in the theater and radio together, so why not in films?
You also got along very well with Greg Toland.
Oh, yes. He came to me, you know. I didn't ask for him. One day in the office they said, there's a man called Toland waiting to see you. And he was, of course, the leading cameraman. And he said, I want to make your picture. And I said, well, that's wonderful. Why? I don't know anything about movies. And he says, that's why I want to do it. He said, because I think if you're left alone as much as possible, we're going to have a movie that looks different. I'm tired of working with people who know too much about it. And he was the one who said, we came to a moment in the first week of shooting where, the second week, where I suddenly was told by somebody that it was not the job of the director to do all the lighting. Up to then, I'd been doing all the lighting, with Toland behind me, balancing it and so on, but saying, don't tell anybody, you see. Then I had to go and apologize to him and everything. Then another awful moment came when I didn't understand directions. And that was because I had learned how to make movies by running Stagecoach every night for a month. Because if you will look at Stagecoach, you will see that the Indians attack left to right, and then they attack right to left, and so on. In other words, there's no direction followed. Every rule is broken in the picture. And I sat and watched it 45 times. So, of course, when I was suddenly told in an over-shoulder shot that I had to look camera left instead of camera right, I said no, because I was standing here. That argument, you know. So we closed the picture down. And about 2 in the afternoon, and went back to my house. And Toland showed me how that worked. And I said, well, God, there's a lot of stuff here I don't know. And he said, there's nothing I can't teach you in 3 hours. And that's when I said that, which has been taken as a very pompous statement that I learned everything in 3 hours. It was Toland's idea that anybody can learn it in 3 hours, and that he taught it to me in 3 hours. Everything else is if you're any good or not.
You don't have to look hard for a shot in Citizen Kane to prove the technical brilliance of Wells' collaboration with Greg Toland. This famous shot is a combination of complicated crane movements, flyaway scenery, and optical effects. At the end of the shot, there's a dissolve disguised in a flash of lightning. Wells and Toland never claimed to have invented new techniques. What they did was to combine existing ones into a virtuoso catalogue of effects: film sets with complete ceilings, overlapping sound, deep focus photography, expressionist lighting. And if you doubt Wells' own contribution to the look of Kane, as some critics have, look first at the lighting designs for his 1937 theatre production, Julius Caesar. This is 3 years before he went to Hollywood. And here's the sequence in the Thatcher Library from Citizen Kane.
Pages 83 to 142.
The story told through this dense and complicated array of techniques is an investigation into a man's life. Kane is seen not simply at different stages of his life, a bravura piece of acting by the 25-year-old Wells, but also through the eyes and the testimony of different witnesses. In fact, which came first? Was it the story of Citizen Kane, or was it the idea of looking at a life from a lot of different...
That was what came first. But my co-author, Mankiewicz, took off with me on the idea of making it based on some big American figure. And we thought of a president. That was because Hughes had got us started thinking that way. And I wasn't going to have played Hughes, because I wouldn't have been good in it. It was going to be Cotton who would have played Hughes. And we said, well, let's get a part I can play. And finally, before we decided what sort of big man it would be, we began on this idea of seeing it from various points of view. And the original scripts, or at least storylines, had much more dramatic differences of point of view. It was much more of a trick. It was much more Rashomon than it ended up being. In other words, the story got a little better than the gag.
What sort of things were they? What sort of things?
Well, just that, you know, the man who hated him, and you saw it. I'm sorry. For instance, a man who hated him, you would then see a scene in which Kane was totally hateful. Somebody who loved him, you would see him totally lovable. And that isn't so in the movie, you know. We see what he is all the time, I think, or at least we tried to do it.
Galleons of Spain off Jersey coast. Is that really your idea of how to run a newspaper?
I don't know how to run a newspaper, Mr. Thatcher. I just try everything I can think of.
Charles, you know perfectly well there's not the slightest proof that this armada's off the Jersey
Hello,
coast.
Mr. Bernstein.
Excuse me, Mr.
Can you
Kane.
prove it isn't?
This just
Mr.
came
Bernstein,
in.
I'd like you to meet Mr. Thatcher.
How do you do, Mr. Thatcher?
Leland, Mr. Thatcher, my ex-guardian.
From
We have
Cuba.
no secrets from our readers, Mr. Bernstein. Mr. Thatcher is one of our most devoted readers. He knows what's wrong with every copy of the Enquirer since I took over. Read the cable.
Girls delightful in Cuba, stop.
Could send you prose poems about scenery, but don't feel right spending your money. Stop. There is no war in Cuba. Signed, Wheeler. Any answer?
Yes, dear Wheeler, you provide the prose poems. I'll provide the war.
That's fine, Mr. Kane.
Yes, I rather like it myself.
Charles,
Send it right away.
I came to see you about this campaign of yours.
You said once that Kane seemed to you to have been really quite close to parody as a character. You said once he was rather close to burlesque. I didn't know if you meant the way you played him or the way he was conceived.
I don't know what I meant by that. Maybe that comes from one of those foreign language interviews where I pretend I understand the question and say, yes, you know. There's a whole lot of things I'm supposed to have said that really come from me not hearing very well or not being as good a linguist as I pretend to be. You know? And there's a kind of interviewer, and you're not one of them, who tends to make a statement and then say, "Isn't that true?" And if I get very bored, or so I say, well, "Absolutely, yes," you know. And that may be how come the parody, because I can't imagine what I had in mind.
What most people thought Wells had in mind was a real-life newspaper tycoon, the biggest of them all, William Randolph Hearst, the Baron of the Yellow Press and one of the most powerful men in America. Look first at the description of Citizen Kane's fictional palace, Xanadu, from the March of Time sequence.
Here on the deserts of the Gulf Coast, a private mountain was commissioned and successfully built. 100,000 trees, 20,000 tons of marble are the ingredients of Xanadu's mountain. Contents of Xanadu's palace: paintings, pictures, statues, the very stones of many another palace. A collection of everything, so big it can never be catalogued or appraised. Enough for 10 museums, the loot of the world. Xanadu's livestock: the fowl of the air, the fish of the sea, the beast of the field and jungle. 2 of each, the biggest private zoo since Noah.
And now look at these shots. This is a home movie made at William Randolph Hearst's real-life palace, San Simeon, 8 years before Kane. Marion Davis, the actress, was to Hearst what the singer Susan Alexander was to Kane, except that Hearst had found himself a devoted, lifelong companion, a woman admired by everyone for her talent and her intelligence.
I thought we were very unfair to Marion Davis because we had somebody very different in the place of Marion Davis, and it seemed to me to be something of a dirty trick, and does still strike me as being something of a dirty trick, what we did to her. And I anticipated the trouble from Hearst for that reason.
What are you doing? Oh, one thing I never can understand, Susan. How do you know you haven't done it before?
Makes a whole lot more sense than collecting statues.
You may be right. I sometimes wonder. But you get into the habit.
Not a habit. I do it because I like it.
I thought we might have a picnic tomorrow, Susan.
Huh?
I thought we might have a picnic tomorrow.
It was the opening night of Citizen Kane in San Francisco, and I found myself going to the top of the mark in the elevator with Mr. Hearst, and I introduced myself. This strange dinosaur, you know, he had ice-cold blue eyes and had a very high, unicoid voice like that. And I said, Mr. Hearst, I didn't bother him with my father or any of that. I just said, I have some good tickets for the opening of Citizen Kane. Would you like to come? And he didn't answer. And I got off the elevator, thinking, as I still do, that if he had been Charles Foster Kane, he would have taken the tickets and gone.
He didn't say anything?
No.
But you seem much more open now, perhaps with the passage of time, to talking about Hearst at all in connection with Citizen Kane, because...
Well, Hearst, you see, launched such an attack on us, particularly on me, or his minions did. It was kind of, can no man rid me of this, and so on. And I was once, well, this will get terribly long and anecdotal, but I'll try to tell it very quickly. I was lecturing in Buffalo, and after the lecture, I was with some people having dinner, and a waiter said, "There's a policeman wants to see you," and I turned white. I always feel guilty when policemen want to see me. And the cop turned out to be very nice. He said, don't go back to your hotel room. I said, why? He said, they've got an underage girl undressed and photographers waiting for you. It's a setup. So I didn't go back to my room that night. I just stayed up, took the plane in the morning. But that was as far as they were prepared to go. I would have gone to jail, of course. And they had the producers in Hollywood ready all together to pay RKO to burn the negative. It was nip and tuck, you know. Whether the negative would be burnt, the picture never shown.
The controversies over Citizen Kane didn't stop in the 1940s. In 1971, an American critic, Pauline Kael, published her account of the writing of Kane, together with the shooting script. She paid particular attention to Wells' co-writer, Herman Mankiewicz, and drew some devastating conclusions based on the evidence of a couple of Mankiewicz's associates. One of them, his secretary, is quoted as saying that Wells did not write or dictate one line of the shooting script of Citizen Kane. And another alleged that Wells actually tried to bribe Mankiewicz not to take a screen credit, so that Kane would be seen to be wholly a Wells creation.
I thought it was a very, very cruel, mean-spirited, and essentially destructive job. I think the thing was a perfectly clear attempt to assassinate Orson. Trying to take away the one picture that he, that everybody said, well, he did make Citizen Kane. So she wanted to say, well, he didn't.
Bogdanovich published his response to Kael in a short essay, and through his friendship with Wells was able to clarify the other side of the story and to detail his evidence against the allegations, including those of Mankiewicz's secretary, that Wells wrote none of the shooting script.
The point is that most of Orson's writing was done with his secretary, with his writing. I found his secretary who said, well, I told her that, and she said, well, I don't know what all that stuff was that I was typing then, And the thing is, she never met Orson. She never even bothered to. That's significant. She didn't even want to talk to him. Here she's writing a book about Citizen Kane, which includes the screenplay. The presumption of not even wanting to speak to, after all, okay, let's say he didn't write it. He did, certainly, no question, direct it, and if he didn't even do that, he's in it. But perhaps she thinks that's Peter Lorre. She tried to take, she tried to indicate that Peter Lorre, that he'd stolen Peter Lorre's makeup from Mad Love, some piece of junk, which I took the trouble to see. That's another thing that critics do. They mention pictures that nobody's ever heard of because nobody can dispute them. And who's going to bother to go run them, I did. And it's a joke, it's like a bad joke.
We've found a copy of even more recent research by a film historian. He's had access to the vital evidence that Kael couldn't have had, or perhaps didn't seek, the various versions of the shooting script, which demonstrate the extent of Wells' contribution. He's also taken the trouble to seek out crucial evidence in memos and letters of the time. This one alone is clear proof that Wells wrote at least 3 scenes himself. Sadly, these refutations were published only in obscure critical journals, while Kael's one-sided account was intended as, and has become, the standard work. Most of Wells' collaborators, including Greg Toland, have died long since, but we found one member of the original team still working in Hollywood. Wells had taken on for Citizen Kane a young film editor from the staff of RKO. He's now the successful Hollywood director, Robert Wise.
Working with him was never very long on an even keel. It was either up or down. Marvelously exciting, stimulating, maddening, frustrating. He could one moment be guilty of a piece of behavior that was so outrageous it'd make you want to tell him to go to hell and walk off the picture, and before you could do it, he'd come up with some idea so brilliant it would literally have your mouth gaping open. And so you never walked, you stayed.
Did the film kind of fall together, as some films appear to do, or did you really have to work at it with it?
Well, no films really fall together. Most editors will tell you that, but it was very well planned. The whole continuity, so many of those very effective long dissolves from one sequence to another with one side of the frame kind of going out and the other coming in, those were all planned in the camera. And not shot in the camera, but planned to go that way. So I think it was very well laid out, very well planned.
You're beautiful.
Oh, I can't.
Yes, you are. You're very, very beautiful.
I've never been to 6 parties in one night
Extremely
in my
beautiful.
whole life. I wouldn't have even been up this late.
It's a matter of habit.
Certainly there was a lot to do within the boundaries of a given sequence. For instance, that marvelous breakfast table scene, you know, the moves and whips back and forth between Orson and his wife and the kind of growing estrangement between them. That was the concept, but the timing of it and the working out took weeks and weeks to do in the cutting room, the speed of those whip pans.
Charles, do you know how long you kept me waiting last night while you went to the newspaper for 10 minutes?
Where the voices would come in before we got to the incoming individual, and that whole timing and rhythm of that.
Your only co-respondent is the Inquirer.
Sometimes I think I'd prefer a rival of flesh and blood.
Oh, Emily, I don't spend that much time on the newspaper.
It isn't just the time. It's what you print. Attacking the president.
You mean Uncle John?
I mean the president of the United States.
He's still Uncle John. He's still a well-meaning fathead who's letting a pack of high-pressure crooks run his administration. This whole oil scandal.
He happens to be the president, Charles, not you.
That's a mistake that will be corrected one of these days.
But it was a very well planned picture, very well prepared, this shooting.
Does that include the structure as well?
Yes, very much so. I don't think that we changed one bit in terms of the continuity. Not that I can remember. Of course, it's been 40 years now, but I believe it was all pretty well quite well as indicated in the script as far as the continuity of the succession of the scenes. I don't think we changed any.
There's another legend that seems to have attached itself to you over the years, and that's that you're a profligate spender, that you go way over on your budget and your shooting schedule.
I've never gone over schedule or over budget.
Nor on Kane?
No. In fact, we were under budget on Kane and under schedule, but we did that by a trick because I said, I don't know anything about movies, so for about 10 days, I'm just going to shoot tests. And what we did was shoot Kane. We shot 10 days of Kane before we admitted we were actually shooting. But we would have been under schedule anyway.
Do you get upset these days, and there's now so much literature on you, do you get upset by some of those legends, particularly the ones to do with people, the ones that suggest that you've behaved irresponsibly towards them?
Very badly. I'm much too upset about them. All my loving friends and keep telling me to stop brooding about it, but it bothers me terribly. Anything that has to do with my behavior. I don't mind how they criticize what I do, but the total lies about me bother me much more than they ought to. I don't know why I'm so touchy about it. And I went into Mr. Chow's restaurant in London once to have lunch alone. I like to eat lunch alone or dinner alone. I brought a book, and they have Italian waiters there, you know. An Italian waiter came and said to me in Italian, "Did you ever make a picture after Citizen Kane?" And I had just been told by Hugh Weldon that I was out of fashion in one of his famously tactful moments. So this came at the wrong moment. And I said patiently to him, "Yes, after Citizen Kane, I made Magnificent Ambersons, and then I listed my pictures. Now, Joan Didion wrote a piece in Esquire a few months afterwards, which she described me coming in to Mr. Chow's with impressive silence and how all heads turned. I opened a book and sat reading it, studying the book and so on, and then suddenly the silence was broken by me saying, I made Citizen Kane in 1940 and so on. Well, do you know that I've been brooding about that thing for 6 years now? That I just sat and delivered a monologue to the audience of lunches at Mr. Chow's about the pictures I'd made, you know. So those kind of things do make me brood a bit. But that's the worst of them. That's my real obsession. The picture of somebody sitting by himself in a restaurant and suddenly reciting his screen credits.
In fact, it wasn't Joan Didion who wrote the article in Esquire. The real culprit was one Robert Allen Arthur.
After Citizen Kane, you made the magazine.
Well, yes.